Okay, qualified persons. We're going to look at, if you're looking at EM 385, we're going to look at that definition. That's on page Q43. We'll look at that in a second. Here's OSHA's definition in section 32 for a qualified person. Again, somebody who has possession of a recognized degree, certificate, professional standing, has extensive knowledge, extensive training and experience, and has already successfully demonstrated their ability to solve or resolve problems related to the subject matter, the work, or the project. Keep this in mind. You know, for example, horizontal lifelines in the subpart M and in EM 385 and in the ANSI standards, Z359, all talk about that horizontal lifelines need to be designed, installed, and used under the supervision of a qualified person. This creates a problem for us in construction. This creates a problem for us in the field, because what's happening is we're just gravitating to competent person instead of understanding there is a specific, clear difference between qualified and competent. So really, we could buy an off-the-shelf system that's designed by an engineer. They're qualified. That we've got the stamp on the literature. We've got the installation criteria. We can read it. They've established it. But are they there supervising the installation and use of the system? No, they're not. EM 385 goes and says, oh, well, the qualified person, if they agree, a competent person can perform the supervision and installation requirements. That's a problem and a conflict, because EM 385 is written on the premise of the more stringent standard shall prevail, which is OSHA, which is that that person has to be there to supervise and install. So one of the things we've been doing is going to manufacturers and asking them to, we select the proper candidate who has extensive training and experience and knowledge in fall protection and these systems, fall protection systems, and we've been asking manufacturers to do qualified person level training on that system for our person to try and make sure that we're meeting the intent of this requirement in the standard. Otherwise, to go to a qualified person fall protection course, I know because I've gone through it, I passed, I'm not sure how, it was really hard, because it's an engineering class and you get taught how to engineer and design these systems, which are very complex. So when we see the term qualified person, it's usually dealing with something at a very high technical level, okay? Electrical qualified, fall protection qualified person, persons designing protective and support systems or designing scaffolds, for example, okay? So in the ANSI standard, same thing, personnel hoist, just to stick to the same theme here. ANSI says same thing, same definition, that's nice. There's some consistency there. So we go over to section Q for EM 385. Yay, same thing, same requirement for the qualified person. So that's great. Now, EM 385 in definitions breaks out just a little more as they start to say for different positions now. The general definition of qualified person as it applies across the board is consistent between ANSI, OSHA, HIOSH, and EM 385. But when EM 385 talks about the qualified person for electrical, which we would see more information in the NFPA 70E standard, okay? But this is somebody who, due to their knowledge, ability, experience, specialized training, or licensing, can competently and safely perform the required and assigned electrical duties or functions, okay? And this EM 385 combines construction and general industry all together. OSHA breaks it out separate. It's one of the other differences between the two regulations. And then this talks about this includes skills and techniques necessary to distinguish exposed live parts from other parts of electrical equipment, how to determine nominal voltage of exposed live parts, clearance distances, and corresponding voltages to which the qualified person would be exposed. And this is important because this is part of the 70E standard criteria too. So then the definition goes further with some notes for us, and it talks about whether an employee is considered to be qualified depends on various circumstances. You could be qualified with certain equipment, but unqualified with regards to others, just like scaffolding. I could be a competent person for an aerial lift, but not for a tubular welded frame mobile scaffold. Okay, depending on my training and experience, right? So they then go on to talk about here an employee who's undergoing on-the-job training and in the course of the training has demonstrated their ability to perform duties safely at his level of training or who's under the direct supervision of a qualified person is considered to be a qualified person for the performance of those duties. So this is just going into the NFPA standard for 70E and EM 385, which has incorporated that. Same thing, qualified person for fall protection in EM 385 really has adopted the NCZ 359 standard, and these are industry standards, consensus standards that are best practices, recognized and current, versus OSHA, which is pretty generic and standard and hasn't been changed in a long time, as I mentioned earlier. So same thing, person who's recognized or capable of designing systems, analyzing and evaluating these. But this also says that, if I back up for a second, that they have extensive knowledge, training, and experience in fall protection and the rescue field, okay? And even with designing and analyzing and evaluating fall protection and rescue systems. And it says they shall have, so remember, this is a person we're saying who has to design horizontal lifelines, right? They shall have an advanced understanding of the regulatory requirements, physical sciences, engineering principles that affect these systems for fall protection and rescue. They should be able to calculate forces generated by an arrested fall, the total loading and deflection of the fall arrest anchorage, impact on the structural members to which the fall arrest system is attached, and be able to determine safe locations of anchorages and supervise the design, selection, installation, and inspection of certified anchorages and horizontal lifelines. That's substantial. That is not the same as what a competent person says. That is a significantly higher level of education and experience, okay? Then it goes on and it talks about a qualified person trainer. And it said that this person is a qualified person who meets the requirements of these standards and who is qualified to provide fall protection training. And so our training for qualified persons is required to be done by a qualified person trainer, or for competent persons by a competent or qualified person trainer. So these are very important things to differentiate and to sit back and think about and understand, well, what does my workplace look like right now? Do I even know who my competent persons are? How am I identifying good candidates? What do I need competent person supervision of? What subject matter, right? How am I equipping these folks and verifying their comprehension? How am I documenting that I've given them this responsibility and designation? And how am I supporting them in the field and mentoring them and providing them the oversight that's necessary for them to fulfill their duties? They might need my support as a superintendent or a project manager or a safety manager, coming out and showing everybody else that I support them and that they are actually in this role actively and helping them resolve issues, right? And building their credibility and their confidence. They need that assistance, just like we do as safety people or as supervisors, right? So challenging you to kind of sit back and think about the process that you have in place right now, and how are you documenting it? If something happened, how could you provide evidence of that? And then have you measured it to see how effective it is, right? Is it actually accomplishing what you intended it to, or what the standard intended it to, right? Which really, if you think about the OSHA standard, it is all over the place with regards to different standards and definitions of competent persons. And I actually wish OSHA would have provided more clarification, more direction, so that people could understand the comprehensiveness and the seriousness of this position and how to make sure it gets put in place the right way. So this is actually taken from the OSHA general construction general requirements. It says the exact same thing under general industry, by the way. And just as a side note, you know, which rule applies to us under OSHA or OSHA has to do with what work we're performing, not who we work for. So if I work for a construction company, but I'm out doing maintenance warranty work, I could actually be falling under the general industry standard, not the construction standard. Or my work in my warehouse is actually under the general industry standard, not the construction standard, because I'm a construction company. So it's important to differentiate between that. So I call this a catch-all competent person regulation. I'm not sure most people pay attention to this in the general requirements. In fact, our HIOSH general requirements, and I think they were last updated in 2012, but most of the paragraphs haven't been changed since 82, 88. And considering that, they're written really pretty well, okay? So I'm actually pretty pleased with that. And so this says, when work is to be performed by or under the supervision of a designated person, that person shall have the degree of competence necessary to perform or direct the work in a safe manner. So this is a general requirement. So if there's a specific regulation that is silent on the competent person requirements, then guess what? In the state of Hawaii, every rule that it's silent on defaults back to this general requirement, okay? Anybody we put in charge of work has to have a degree of competency necessary to perform or direct the work in a safe manner. And that means they need to have knowledge, experience, and authority, if you think about it, back to the definition of competent person, okay? So again, one of the most basic criteria in the HIOSH regulations regarding the requirements for competency. I want to throw out a couple other things to consider. I am not an attorney, so I'll throw a disclaimer out there right quickly, but I have been around and worked around attorneys and incidents and situations long enough that I've heard these terms brought up and discussed enough that it scared me and got my attention. And one term is called negligent hiring, and another term is called negligent retention. And these liabilities normally refer to an employer's obligation not to hire an applicant or to retain an employee that the employer knew or should have known was likely to undertake conduct against other individuals or otherwise subject employees or third parties to, right, that could create a legal liability. Let's speak English. They hired somebody who was not capable or qualified to do or fulfill that responsibility, or someone who was not willing to. They retained someone in a position who had demonstrated that they were not going to supervise the work and make sure it was performed in a safe manner. Think about that for a second. Negligent hiring and negligent retention. You know, with all the workforce needs that we have out there, we really should be pouring into our supervisors, training them up, making sure they're educated and equipping them so they can make good decisions. But there can be employer liability, especially for willful misconduct. That means knowingly not following the rules, knowingly not enforcing the requirements, or knowingly not providing a safe and healthy workplace. And a supervisor is given authority by the employer and acts on behalf of the employer. Therefore, when the supervisor doesn't follow the rules or enforce the rules, that means the employer is not following the rules or enforcing the rules. Now, we have legitimate and affirmative defenses under OSHA, which are actually very difficult to prove. But if someone was, you know, if I had a supervisor out there, unbeknownst to me, but I had to be out looking and trying to detect, prevent and detect, was everything okay on my sites? And one day they told somebody, oh, you don't have to do that. Not how I trained them, I can prove it. Not how I had communicated the rule consistently and widespread. Not how I had enforced the rule in the past, right? Not consistent with my policies and my procedures, all these things along the line. And somebody got hurt because they told them not to do something or allowed them not to do something, omission and commission, right? And I turn around as the employer, somebody gets hurt and I fired them immediately and I'm disciplining them and I can prove I met my reasonable care standard as the employer, and this was just an isolated incident. This was employee misconduct on the part of the supervisor. Again, if you haven't read the requirements in the field operations manual for OSHA on how to establish an affirmative or legitimate defense, you should look into that. Maybe we'll have time during our how to handle OSHA inspection to talk about that more. But, you know, most people think, oh yeah, that was employee misconduct, no big deal. No, the employer has a burden to prove that you fulfilled your requirements to avoid employee misconduct, okay? So if this person's out there and you're retaining them in a position of authority as a competent person because they're supervising work, and something goes wrong, you could be responsible and liable for their willful misconduct. So really important. So in doing some research into this, the major difference I've found between negligent hiring and retention is basically the timing. Negligent hiring deals with an employer's duty to use reasonable care in hiring an employee, and negligent retention involves the employer's duty of reasonable care in retaining adequate employment. And so a lot of this goes back to, again, properly identifying the competent persons, properly equipping them, supporting them in the field, making corrections where we need to be. And if that person is not fulfilling the obligations and responsibility, they aren't, or they won't, or they can't, then we need to do something about it, okay? Or God forbid something happen and now we're in an even worse situation, okay? And I'm just thinking through like my personal experience. I can think of a lot of supervisors I've run into that this is why it got my attention so much when I started hearing attorneys talking about this, because I thought, oh my gosh, you know, is that negligent retention? What do we need to do to fix this, right? Did we just hire somebody and put them in a position that they couldn't fulfill? Are we measuring this? Are we balancing this? What do we need to do to fix this, okay?